Hello and good day, Covenant Life. This is Pastor Andrew Newland, and welcome to the Covenant Stories podcast. We are certainly glad to have you join us for this episode, and we're hoping that you're having a wonderful day whenever and wherever you are. So, before we get into this episode, I would just like to take a minute to give everybody a proper expectation of just what is our Covenant Stories podcast and what it contains. So, these stories are the life testimonies of the faithful members of our church, and each one of these stories is very different. And as a general reminder, I would just like everyone to know that oftentimes our stories, they contain, varying levels of just traumatic experiences that really shape us and build us into who we are. So what that looks like is often very different, but I just want to give a gentle reminder to our audience that the purpose of this podcast is to share these stories with our church family. And in the process, some of the stories may have moments that may be somewhat difficult emotionally to listen through. But I would ask that everyone listening just be aware of the sensitive nature of some of the content and just understand that if it's difficult to listen to, it was probably unimaginable to live through. So please just be sensitive to those who are willing to publicly share their testimony. And after you listen to their story, just give them a hug and thank them the next time you see them, because this process can be very difficult to go through, and sharing your story for the world to hear is not always an easy thing to do. So again, we just thank you so much for joining us, and we pray that you are able to receive exactly what it is that God has for you from this episode. So without further ado, please enjoy this episode of the Covenant Stories podcast. All right, welcome to the Covenant Stories podcast. So it's been a few weeks. We had Easter, all that fun stuff that, it's church time. But this episode, we have a husband and wife combination that I have been personally looking forward to interview for a while. So we have Maggie and Gary Torrisi. How are we doing?
Yay.
We're good.
Yeah.
We're blessed.
Good.
How's life been with y'all through the Easter season? Was it as busy as most Easter church seasons?
It was kind of calm.
Okay.
We did go out of town because Easter kind of fell around our anniversary. We just celebrated 22 years.
22. Nice.
Yes. So we went up to Pigeon Forge for a couple days and came back in time for Easter service.
Wow. I didn't realize y'all did the exact same thing I did. We had our anniversary trip that week before Easter as well.
Yes.
Yeah. When's y'all's anniversary?
The 7th.
Okay.
Yeah, we usually get together with family, but they're in Statesboro and Savannah.
Yeah.
We couldn't just do that this year. But
yeah, Savannah's surprisingly farther drive than you would think.
Yeah, 5 hours.
Yes.
Yeah, we have to go through Atlanta. So we just decided to, have a nice
head up to the mountains.
One here, and
Nice.
We'd rather go to the mountains than we would to Florida, like most people.
Yeah. Although I am going to Florida in 2 weeks. But.
Yeah. That's a girl's trip, though.
Girls trip.
Girls trip.
So, as most of our covenant stories go, it's really just a time for people of our church to come together and share their testimony. So, with that being said, I think we agreed that Maggie gets to start things rolling. Maggie, would you tell us a little bit about just kind of the beginning of your testimony, of how things started with you as far as your walk with God?
Well, my walk with God started actually when I was little, and my father would take us to church, to the Methodist church. My mom never went to church. It was just my dad. He would take us, and sometimes we'd stay home with mom and everything. And in school, in elementary school, when I was 11 years old, my little brother wanted to join an after-school club. And my dad told me I had to stay with him because my little brother got beat up a lot when he was younger. He had an eye disease called amblyopia. He wore a patch over his good eye and wore glasses, and he was short for his age. So all the bullies, he was a target.
You were the big older sister, though.
I was the big older sister.
Protecting little brother.
I didn't want to go. And I didn't know what kind of club it was and everything. So I sat there and I went to this club, and it was called the Good News Club. It was put on by the Baptist church near our house. And I didn't want to be there, so the first week that I was there, I really just sat in the corner and stared at this green felt board, wondering how they got the pictures to stick on it. It's an 11-year-old mind.
It's magic.
It's magic, yes. And so the following week, I kind of had a little change of attitude. So the following week, I went ahead and started paying attention to the story. And although I went to Sunday school at the Methodist Church, at that point, I finally understood what the gospel message was. It was more than this green felt board.
Yeah.
The pictures came to life as they were telling the story and stuff. So I got saved that day.
Second week?
The second week.
Wow.
And my little brother, he raised his hand because I raised my hand.
Oh.
It's like, and he was there for the candy and the snacks. I figured him out, and stuff. But so they went and approached my dad because I was 11. I was getting ready. Back then in the 70s, we had, I was raised in Daytona Beach, so we had a 7th grade center. So all the 7th graders in the county would converge on this one school.
Wow.
And so I was getting ready to go to the 7th grade center. So the woman that was hosting the Good News Club said, hey, why don't you join our youth group? Because we're allowed to have 11-year-olds that are getting ready to transition to the upper level. So I went to, she took us home and sat down with my dad. My dad was a very prideful man and stuff. He loved the Lord, but he was very prideful. And he listened to her and he looked at me and he goes, you didn't understand anything that you've been taught until now.
He was saying that to you or her?
Yeah, to me.
Oh, wow.
And I said, no,
okay.
I didn't. I said, it just, I don't know what it is. I felt something here in my heart.
Wow. So your dad, you said your dad was a, church-going man, and your mom wasn't. So basically what you're saying is like he had been teaching you stuff and it was like going over your head. Is that kind of where it was at?
Well, the Sunday school class was going over my head.
I got you. Okay.
And so I didn't understand anything about the gospel and who Jesus was until that day. So she asked him if I could come to the youth group. The youth group met on Wednesday nights. And reluctantly, he said yes. And as time went on, Wednesday night turned into Sunday morning, Sunday school, Sunday night, and everything. And I started flourishing there and stuff. So that was my first real encounter with God and everything. I sang in the school chorus. I was in county chorus and state chorus, and then when I got to the church, they had a youth choir that sang on Sunday nights, and so I sang in the youth choir. So it was really good. And our youth director was a graduate from Stetson University School of Music. Okay. And so he knew how to teach us to sing. And it was really good. So
just, was that a different church? So you'd said you'd been going to Sunday school, like with your dad?
Yeah.
And so that was kind of, taking you away. Methodist to Baptist is a pretty drastic transition there. I could understand his reluctance.
But I understood. Yeah. That was the thing. I understood and stuff. And he was a little hurt by it, but he let it happen and everything. So
well, that's good.
So that was a good thing.
So that was the, youth, teenage years. Where did that take you once you got through those teenage years?
So, a lot of drama. When I got to the 7th grade center, I still went to the Baptist church. When I went into 8th grade, I went to the Baptist church, and I was part of a Bible club at the school. Back then, they still hadn't fully kicked the Bible out. And so we had a Bible club, and I was part of it. And then when I turned 14, I joined an organization to help prepare me for college. And it was called Upward Bound. It was held at Embry-Riddle Aeronautical University. So whenever, on Saturdays during the school year, I was there from 8 in the morning till 3 in the afternoon. It was tutoring sessions for math, English, and science. And then they would have electives. My elective was flying.
Okay.
So I got to fly the flight simulators. I got to fly Cessna 172. Once a month, I got to go up in the air. And whenever I went to fly, we got to go to different places. So we were privileged to land on the USS Saratoga in Jacksonville. We went to Ringling Museum, and there was a private field, and I got to land there and take off there and then go to the museum while we were there and have lunch.
That's cool.
And so it was just different wild things that we could do. And during the summer, I lived on campus at Embry-Riddle for 6 weeks. And the organization, they were God-centered during that time. They were trying to teach you and train you to be productive adults. They were trying to help you figure out what you wanted to do with your life, too. So I did that from age 14 until I graduated from high school.
Wow.
In high school, I also joined the Air Force Junior ROTC.
Yeah.
So I moved up in the ranks in there as well. I was on the drill team and honor guard and stuff, and performed rifle routines and stuff. So yes, I was the one that took a 40-pound rifle and threw it over your head. So I did stuff like that. And church was still there, but it evolved at that point where, as I was meeting other kids, and there were other Christian kids, I would go to their churches or go, and I was still going to church, but it was everywhere.
Yeah, kind of scattered,
Yeah. So one of the guys in our ROTC unit, he was becoming an ordained minister through his church. His church belonged to his father, grandfather, great-grandfather, and stuff. And it was a black church. So all us white kids are going into the hood to this black church. And it's like, okay.
Culture shock.
It was, but yet it was fun.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
I mean, it was a culture shock coming from a Baptist church, and you're seeing these people, are they're hooting and hollering and running the aisles, and it's like, wow, I like this. And it's like, that's where it went from there. So the church still had a major role, but there was some trauma that was taking place in high school too. I was, and Gary knows this story well, so I was dating somebody in high school, and there was a teacher that was coming in between him and I, and he was grooming me.
Oh my.
And I went and talked to somebody, but because everybody at the school was part of the Masonic Lodge, my dad was in the Masonic Lodge, and it was like, no, we ain't touching this.
Yeah.
And so I had a friend of mine who we still talk every now and then through Facebook, but she would see what he was doing as far as he dismissed the class and make sure I stayed behind. So she stayed behind.
Yeah.
And he'd start getting mad and pick up on that. Then as I was getting ready to graduate, back then scholarships weren't as readily available as they are today. And I didn't want to put my parents in a financial bind either. They had already, I'm number 7 of 8.
Oh, wow.
So just to give you an idea. And so there was no money for my dad to send me to school. My dad was disabled. My mom worked 2 jobs. And so it wasn't there. So we got a phone call from this boyfriend's aunt and uncle, this ex-boyfriend's aunt and uncle. His uncle, he was in a wheelchair, and they called for my mom and my dad and me to come to their house. And they offered to have me move in with them and help with him.
Oh, okay.
And they would pay for me to go to junior college.
Wow.
And my dad wasn't there that day. He had a Masonic Lodge thing in Orlando. And so Mom just listened and everything, and we left the house. And I kept saying, I want to do it, because I loved them.
Yeah.
They were just an awesome couple. And I just sat there, and I'm like, I want to do it. And we have to talk to your dad.
Yeah.
And so when my dad got home, my mom told him why they wanted us over, and he goes, no. The pride just came up. No, they're not telling me they're going to raise my daughter. I raised my daughter. And it developed into this big argument. And so let things cool down for a couple days. And my dad and I, we used to go out. I was a daddy's girl, so we used to go out on little daughter-daddy date things. And we went out, and I tried to talk to him about it. And he stayed calm. He wasn't angry about the conversation, and he just wasn't having it.
Yeah. And
my brothers, my 2 older brothers, they went into the military, and we knew the recruiter really well for the Air Force. And it was February of 1981, and I told him, I said, well, let's go see Fred. So he was fine. We're going to go see Fred. So we went, and I signed up for the Air Force in the delayed enlistment program. And I went to the MEP station, and the military isn't like it is today. You go, they tell you what job you're going to get. It wasn't. My test scores were high enough that I could have any job in the Air Force.
Yeah.
So I went there, and the recruiter at the MEP station sat me down, and he goes, so what are your top 3 jobs you would want? And I said, air traffic controller, because of the stuff that I was doing at Embry-Riddle, and then security police officer, or a secretary. That was it. And he goes, well, those are nice jobs, but we're going to put you in something else. Congress just opened up a job classification for women in the Air Force, and that's what you're going to do. And so he hands me a piece of paper, and it says 462XO, Aircraft Armament Systems Specialist, F-16 aircraft. I'm like, what's that?
Yeah. Not very self-explanatory at all.
He goes, you're going to load bombs on the airplane.
Oh, okay.
And I sat there, and I'm like, okay. And it just opened up for women, so what does that mean?
Exactly,
He goes, you're a pioneer. And so he started building it up. You're like Amelia Earhart was a pioneer in aviation. You're going to be a pioneer and stuff. And they just built it up and built it up. So I wasn't leaving right away. I wasn't leaving until the fall. So I came home from MEPS, and my oldest brother, was stationed at Eglin Air Force Base up in the Panhandle of Florida. And he called to see what job I got. And my dad was like, your brother wants to talk to you. So I'm talking to him, and I tell him, and he goes, put Dad back on the phone. I said, okay. And so I get Dad back on the phone. He's like, you go and tell Fred to change her job, or she ain't going.
Wow.
And he was fit to be tied. He drove home.
Goodness gracious.
He worked on the flight line in egress systems on aircraft, and he knew the people in that job classification. Yeah. And he was like, no, you can't do this. Don't do it. Yeah. And there was nothing that we could do. When with the military back then, there was no cross training. There had to be a specific reason for a cross train, not just because I'm not liking that job. And so I went into the military. My goal at that time was I'm going to go to college, let the military pay for my college. If me and this ex-boyfriend decide to get back together, we will. We were still communicating. If we decide to get back together, so be it. If not, we'll just take it from there. So I was so busy when I was in basic training. The only way you could get out of training on Sunday was to go to church. So I went to a Pentecostal church, and that was fun.
Yeah.
It took me back to that little black church in Daytona. So it was like we had a blast in there. And because we were at church, we didn't have to train, do anything. We could do whatever we wanted on Sunday. And so that was my life in basic training. I got stationed in Denver. My sister lived out there. So on the weekends, I went home. I went to her home.
Yeah.
Left the barracks, went to her home. And I became the cool person in the barracks because of what my brother-in-law did. My brother-in-law was an advertiser for Coors. And he was like the head guy.
Yeah.
And so whenever I came to visit before I left, he'd open up the trunk and he goes, "Here you go."
Load you up.
And the thing about it was back then in Denver, if you were 18 to 21, you couldn't drink but 3.2 beer is what they called it. And after 21, you could drink whatever you wanted.
Yeah.
So he would load me up with 12.0 take back to the barracks and everything. So I became the cool person. It's like I'd pull into the barracks on Sunday evening and it's like, "Were you at your sister's?" "Yes, here you go." and everything. So then I went home on leave for like 30 days and connected with the ex-boyfriend during that time, and we talked, and we basically were just like, whatever, like he needed to focus where he was at because he was in a military academy, so he needed to focus in on that. And so I knew what I was going to do. So I get to MacDill Air Force Base, first woman bomb loader,
Tampa, Florida.
All right.
And I get there. My dad dropped me off, and I was going to buy a car when I got there. So Dad dropped me off, and he dropped all the kids off when they went to their duty station. But he was never met with what he got met with when we showed up at MacDill. And Daddy wanted to take me home. And because we pulled up to the main gate, and protesters were out at the main gate. They had 2 ICBM missiles sitting out on the ramp out in the open, and the nuclear protesters were going nuts. So we went through the gate and got to headquarters, and they called the unit that I was assigned to tell them that I was there. So they show up in a pickup truck. So we transfer all my stuff out of my dad's car into the pickup truck. And the tech sergeant looked at my dad and he goes, "You got 30 minutes to get off this base." And my dad goes, "Can I at least see where her barracks is?" And he's like, "No. Get in your car. You have 30 minutes to get off this base. Period."
Interesting.
So they sent him on his way. So, basically, I went through the in-processing thing, but I was not greeted.
It's very odd.
It was a very, my first roll call there, the senior master sergeant called my name. I announced myself like we were supposed to do, and he looked at me and he said, "You know, Congress said that you women have to be in this career field, but I don't like it."
Yeah, so let's, for clarity, just so everyone knows, this is the early 80s. Can you talk a little bit about just the not only political, but kind of like gender and military climate, just so we have, for anybody listening who may not know exactly why there's some stigma going on?
Looking back, and if you look at old military war movies, if you look at TV shows and look at movies, especially in the 70s, they came out with Private Benjamin, Stripes. You had Baba Black Sheep, Squadron, MASH. There was a sexualization of women.
Mm-hmm.
Unfortunately, it's true. That's how the military treated women. And women had their place. You can be a nurse, you can be a secretary, but don't you dare step foot on my flight line and say that you're going to work on my jet.
Yeah.
And so it was like he didn't want me there.
Yeah.
And he pretty much read it out and said that by the time he got done with me, I would either be AWOL, I would be in a body bag, straight jacket, just committing suicide.
Goodness. So, yeah, it was just the boys' club of all boys' clubs, as far as like it was, women could not possibly be competent enough to work on, that's unbelievable.
And so it was a really, I went from this, I'm a daddy's girl, and everything I was doing in school, I'm succeeding at, and I get here, and it's like, I felt like I was in a nightmare. From the barracks on down, I felt like I was in a nightmare. The barracks was like Animal House, literally.
Goodness gracious.
We had to walk through the men's section. The ladies were on the second floor, and there was only this half-wall partition right by the door. I should say the doorway, not a door, because there wasn't a door to the women's bathroom where our showers and everything were. There was nothing. So the guys could just walk around and walk into our bathroom.
Grief.
And they would. If they heard the showers going, they would literally come in there with their Polaroids. And so I went to the gym.
Yeah.
I didn't even want to even attempt it. I could go to the gym. And it was just stuff like that. I had tools thrown at my head. And I'm talking big tools because some of the tools that we worked on for gun pods, they were huge.
Oh, I can't imagine.
And they would be thrown by my head. I'd be shown centerfolds and told that I needed to dress that way when I came to work. And just different things. Then they had sexual harassment training.
Wow.
And
seems much needed, though. Yeah.
And the first thing that happened when they created this sexual harassment training, the senior master sergeant at roll call, he told everybody, he goes, you'll be going in groups. The appointments were all scattered out. And he was like, when you go, keep this in mind. If it wasn't for our job, the Air Force would not be but another airline. They can't do nothing to us. Nothing applies to us, period.
You're above the law.
We are above the law.
Goodness gracious.
And so whatever they teach you, forget it when you leave their presence, because it doesn't apply here. So then I got warned, don't you dare tell them what we keep doing to you. And it's like, okay. And literally my life was being threatened on a regular basis. So I got there in March of 1982, and in April 18th to be exact, I woke up in ICU.
Oh my gosh.
I couldn't tell you. I can only tell you what they told me happened to me. I just remember I got off duty, was walking up to the barracks, and saw the girl that lived across the hall from me sitting out on a picnic table, and I was going to ask her if she wanted to go to the bowling alley and get something to eat. And I woke up in ICU several days later. And I had a traumatic brain injury. I was ordered not to call my parents. They knew my parents lived in Daytona, and they were like, do not call your parents. I was in the hospital for a while with this, of course, and nothing was done to the person that did this to me. There was no trial. There was nothing. So from there, while I was in the hospital, the night shift supervisor for my unit started coming to the hospital and befriending me. It was like, you get to a point where you're beat down so much that when someone sits there and starts saying, I'm on your side, I'll protect you, you believe it.
Yeah.
And he made that appearance thereof. And when I got back to the barracks and stuff, I woke up in the middle of the night with him on top of me. And he repeatedly did this, and nobody would do anything.
Goodness gracious.
And I became pregnant. And when the day I found out I was pregnant, I went back to the shop, and my immediate supervisor, I pulled him into a room, and his supervisor, I pulled him in. The person who did this to me wasn't there yet, and I told him I'm pregnant, and he's the one who did this, and I this is what's been happening. And they just, my immediate supervisor rolled his eyes up in his head, and he goes, you're gonna die. I'm like, what? You're gonna die. And so they called this guy in, and they told him, she's pregnant. Now what? And all of a sudden it was like, I wasn't even in the room. And the three of them are sitting here talking, and it was like, the guy, he sat there and he goes, well, I'll go to the bank, get the money. You know where to take her. Just get it done. I mean, and I sat there and I'm going, no, I'm over here and nobody's killing a baby today. Because as they were sitting there talking, it took me back to 1971, where I watched my dad cry listening to Walter Cronkite on the news. I used to sit on my dad's lap while he was watching the news, and he was bawling like a baby because Roe v. Wade passed. And he made me promise, even though I didn't understand it then, that day it all flooded back.
My goodness.
And I said, I'm not killing no baby. I'm not doing it. I got pushed down the stairs. They made me work around different chemicals. They were literally trying to force an abortion with what they were doing with me. And it was a really, really bad time. And I felt like God just left me. And that I was just, and I called my dad and I talked to him. I didn't talk to my mom about it because growing up, my mom was always working, so I didn't have that bond with my mom. I had it with my dad, and I called him and I told him what was going on, and he sat there and he goes, don't kill that baby. And I said, I'm not going to. And he goes, but here's the other thing, you can't come home unless you have a husband. Didn't matter how I got that way. He put that perimeter on me at that point. And I made a decision to cut everybody off from my childhood, cut everything off. At that point, I felt like I was damaged goods. Nobody would want me. I was saving myself for marriage. It's been destroyed now. I'm going to have a baby. Don't know what I'm going to do. And it went on like that. There was no help for me at all. None. Everything was keep it a secret, keep it a secret, keep it a secret. From my father to the leadership, keep it a secret. Don't discuss it. They didn't even want me in a maternity uniform at that time. And I was really just an emotional wreck. They still had me work. They actually told the wing commander that they were sending me to a fat camp because I had put on some weight, and he was like, why do you have a fat person working in here? And it's like, they said, oh, she's going to weight loss program. She had something wrong. So he didn't even know I was pregnant. And right away, he didn't know. I got so angry one night, I went to confront the person that did this to me. And he made an example of me, that he was untouchable. The next night, I went back for the sole purpose I was going to take him out.
Yeah.
I lost it at that point. So they put me in a hospital. And during that time, there was this medic that kept coming around, talking to me, and I was just an emotional wreck. The doctors were like, well, you just need a rest. So you rest here for 30 days, and we're going to send you back. That was traumatizing in itself, too, because the padded cell was like down the hall from my room, and there was somebody in there, and every day, 24/7, all I heard was banging. I still hear it today.
Oh my gosh.
And it's like, so they finally said, okay, you had enough rest, you need to go back. And I went back, and they put me back in the hellhole again. This time, I was in my maternity uniform because the medical team said, no, you can wear your maternity uniform. So I got my maternity uniform, and I showed back up at work. They were mad because I was in my uniform. They were doing something within the building that we worked at, and the doctors told them, I can't be in that building at all because there was some toxic fumes and stuff. And they said, well, you will be in the building. So they set a desk up outside a window and had me crawl through these jalousie windows, they're folding windows, and had me crawl through. And if I didn't do it, they would threaten me with Article 15s and stuff like that. So I was sitting outside one day, and they were trying to get me to come in because they were going to grab at me while I was trying to come through the window, being pregnant. And the wing commander pulled up, and he called me over to the car, and he goes, why is that desk out here? And I told him. I just went blah. I blurted everything out to him, and he was shocked. He just looked at me, and he was like, I want you to get in your car, and I want you to go to your squadron commander's office, walk in there, and tell them I'm on my way. I said, okay. And just sit there until I get there. I said, okay. So I went, walked in. The first sergeant said, what do you want? And I said, the wing commander's on his way, and he asked me to sit here until he got here. And I sat down. And the first shirt was going ballistic. Why is the wing commander coming here? It'd be like the president of the United States coming.
Yeah.
You know, what is going on? And he walked in. He went back and talked to the squadron commander, and I got moved out of that shop, that unit, that day.
Yeah.
And I went to work for a lieutenant until my pregnancy was over. But during that time frame, there was like nothing for me. There was nothing, no counseling, nothing. I met someone, and because I wanted to go home and see my dad, I married him. It wasn't out of love.
Yeah.
It was, I want to go see my dad. And this is the perimeter he gave for me to come home and see him. And we got married a month before the baby was born. He promised he'd give the baby his name. He promised all sorts of stuff. And when the baby was born, he said no. And I started going through another transition of hell at that time. And I gave my son up for adoption. And before I did so, I had a meltdown in the hospital room, and a woman came in and hugged me and gave me a number to Catholic Charities and said they'll make sure he goes to a good home. So after that, it was like I was in a self-destructive path.
Oh, yeah.
And my mom had told the ex-boyfriend that I had gotten married, and I got a letter from him, and he said, well, your mom said that you're married, and so I've met somebody, so I'm going to pursue that. And that was the last I heard from him, and I didn't even respond, because that part of my life, because I felt like I was so damaged, I didn't even want anything to do with that part of my life. I didn't want to talk to anybody about it. And God was so far away from me, it wasn't even funny. And I started drinking, and it was just bad from the get-go.
I can't even imagine.
I went through a miscarriage after that. I went through, I had my daughter after that. Went through my separation. I had to wait to divorce this guy because he went overseas, and he was protected under the Soldier Sailor Act. And so I had another boyfriend who was a lawyer who got me pregnant, and he came up with a wife. And it was like, it was just this roller coaster. And every now and then God sent someone to me. You got to get back. You got to get back to the church. And it was just these little whispers, and you got to get back to the church. And when I was pregnant with my youngest son, I got back into the church at the Assemblies of God Church and everything. But Christians beat up on each other sometimes.
Yes, they do.
And they made me feel shameful.
Yeah.
Because here I have 3 children, 3 different dads, is how they looked at it. But they didn't look at why was this here.
Yeah, they want the, stats. They don't want the story.
Right. So that's where that was at. And then the Gulf War was getting ready to kick up, and I had transferred from active duty to the Alabama National Guard, and they told me I had to give my son to his dad in case we got deployed. We weren't sure. His dad, just because he was a lawyer, he handled everything, and I'm just going to leave it at that. It wasn't good. And I went back to MacDill Air Force Base during the Gulf War. And
with the National Guard?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
So I went back. They went to Saudi Arabia, but I went back. I was a trainer at that time. So I went down to MacDill, and I was down there trying to figure out what I'm going to do with my life at this point. I didn't want to go back to the Guard unit. The Guard unit got in trouble during the Gulf War in Saudi Arabia because the women in the Guard unit were becoming prostitutes. They shipped beer over, which is illegal in Saudi Arabia. They were doing a lot of crazy stuff. So I didn't want to go back there. And so I resigned and stayed in Tampa. And at that point, I sat there and I said, well, let me go to the police academy and I'll do that. No contact with my children at that point. My oldest son was given up for adoption. My daughter in the divorce, because relatives matter in Alabama. My ex-husband got custody of her and gave her to his parents. And then my youngest son was living with his dad. And nobody would let me see any of my kids. And so I self-medicated and I felt this is what society is like. This is what adulthood's like, because nobody told me anything different.
Goodness gracious.
And I went through the police academy, and I didn't realize how much damage the head injury in the military had done. And I had a stroke while my last week there. So that got kicked out from under me. So it was just this roller coaster.
Yeah.
I went back to college, got my degree, went to work eventually for household finance. I worked in their legal department and collections division, and because I'm a paralegal by trade. So then this girl kept saying, hey, you need to come to church, and I'm like, here we go again. you know. And so the Lord kept tugging at me at that point. And so she convinced me to go with her.
Yeah.
And that Saturday night, I was wrestling with God. I pulled out my Bible, I dusted it off, and I'm sitting there just wrestling with God. And I got a phone call from a friend of mine who was an over-the-road truck driver. We were just friends, and he called every now and then when he was out driving just to stay awake. And so he called, what's going on? I'm like, I'm just wrestling with God. And he goes, well, you know what? I think you need to go back to church. And he never talked about God in our conversations. And he sat there and talked about God that day. And he goes, I think you need to go back to church. I think that would do you some good. And I'm like, okay. It's nice talking to you.
Yeah.
And I sat there and I'm looking at my Bible and just wrestling the whole night.
Yeah.
Next morning, I got up, got dressed, and my friend calls me and she says, I'm sick. I'm not going to church, but you can go. I don't need to be holding your hand. And I'm like, I am not driving all the way across Tampa to go to a church that I don't know anybody.
Yeah.
And everything. So I sat there and I said, who goes to church that's in my circle? It's like going through the Rolodex, and my hairdresser goes to church. So I said, I'll call her, see where she's going. So I called her up and she goes, oh yeah, I go to church over here near your apartment over here in Town and Country, which was the area where we were living. And I said, where's that? And she's telling me where it's at. And I'm like, that's a school. I get stopped in that school zone every day. It's like, that's a school. She goes, if you pay attention, you see the steeple. It's like, all right, I'll meet you there. So I got there, and I got there early. Praise team was practicing in the sanctuary, and I'm wrestling with God.
Yeah.
I walked in, and the first thing when I sat down in the pew, nobody was in there. Everybody's at Sunday school except for the praise team, and they're sitting there practicing. And I sat there in the pew, and I'm like, oh God, I'm home. I just felt this warm hug come over me.
Yeah.
And it was like, I'm home. And I couldn't even tell you what the pastor spoke on.
Yeah.
The only thing I heard is, if you want to rededicate your life to the Lord, come down here.
Yeah.
And I ran. And how they operated on altar calls like that is, after you say the salvation prayer, you go back into the conference room with the elders, and they give you a Bible if you need one, or they'll pray with you, whatever your needs are, and they'll pray with you. And that day, the altar was packed that day, so they told us all to go into the conference room. So I go in the conference room, and I'm the only one sitting there, and in walks the guy that was playing bass that day and his wife. And I'm sitting here, I'm like, okay, weren't you just playing bass? And so we started talking, and they prayed with me, and his wife started calling me during the week.
Yeah.
Another woman in the church service, her and her husband and family are from Trinidad, and she would call me. And I would I just want to listen to you speak because of her accent. And she would call me, and she taught a Sunday school class for people who just got back with God. And there was 40 people in that Sunday school class. And so I went to the Sunday school class and everything. And then I was sitting there at church one night, and Pastor, he usually was in prayer with the elders before service and everything, and the praise team was in the back room praying. Well, he comes down and he starts pacing in the front, and he's like, I got a word for somebody, and I can't even pray anymore until I give this word.
Wow.
And it was just like, okay. And I'm looking around, and he's like, who is it? God's going to tell you if it's you. Who is it? And I'm just looking around, and nobody is raising their hand, nobody's saying anything. And the Lord's sitting here going, it's you, it's you. So I'm like, it's me, raise my hand a little sheepishly. And so he comes over and he sat there and he said, God doesn't want you to settle, but he wants you to know that something's going to happen quickly, very quickly, and just know it's him. And everything. Stay focused on him and know when this happens, it's going to happen quickly.
Yeah.
And I'm like, okay, not to settle. I was getting ready to either go back to a guy that was abusing me or move to Kansas at that time. And I was like, okay. So I just kept coming to church. And it was 2 weeks, and I got to meet
Mr. Gary.
Mr. Gary. And I'm going to let him tell the story because he can't stand it when I tell how.
Oh, yeah, we get to hear
met.
Gary's story.
But at that time, at Household Finance, with my bonuses and everything, I was making 6 figures.
Yeah.
He looked at one of my pay stubs one day and he goes, is this how much you make a month? No. It's a week. It's like, what? So God told me to quit my job.
Yeah.
And
That's
I'm
a
like,
big shift.
I'm sitting here, I'm going, what? I worked hard to get to where I'm at, considering everything I went through. I stopped drinking. Isn't that good enough? And it's like, what? Quit my job. And I'd be on the phone with him and I'd pull up in my parking spot and I'd be crying. I don't want to go in there.
Yeah.
I don't want to go in there. And so God gave me every opportunity to quit, and I didn't do it. So he carried me out in an ambulance because I had another massive seizure, mild TIA there in the office. So he carried me out, put me on short-term disability, and everything. So during our premarital counseling, our pastor sat down and he's like, so how well do you know Dr. Seymour? And Dr. Seymour was the dean of the Bible college, but him and his wife were the ones that prayed with me in the back room. And because my dad wasn't alive anymore, and the Lord had me ask Doc to walk me down the aisle for the wedding. And I said, well, he's walking me down the aisle, and he's like, oh, okay, so you do know him. I said, yeah, why? And he's like, because I want you to go to work for him. Doing what? And he goes, I want you to be the registrar of the college. The ministry there had a children's academy that had about 200 students there, and then they had a Christian college seminary that reached the globe.
Wow.
And I'm like, okay, you can't afford me.
Yeah.
I can tell you right now, you can't afford me. And I said, and at that point, God just kind of gave me a nudge, and he said, this is what I want you to do.
Wow.
And so I said, okay, I'll do it. Didn't even know how much he was going to pay me. And everything. It wasn't much. So, for those people who think ministry, you get paid very well, no.
I've never met any of those people. But what I can say is ministry sometimes can pay with money, but it always pays with another type of value that you can't really measure.
And that's it. And it was like, God, why are you doing this? I'm going from loading bombs on aircraft to being a police officer to now being a paralegal, and now you got me working in a Christian college. I'm just getting back to you. What do I have to offer? And I learned so much working there. I got to meet so many interesting people working there. We had campuses in Korea and China and India and Bolivia, in England, in Africa, Canada, Mexico, Dominican Republic, all over. And I got to meet all these people who are serving God, that were learning more to serve God.
Yeah.
I had a man come into our office from South Korea. His sole mission that God has given him was to memorize the Word of God.
Wow.
And take it into North Korea.
Wow.
I mean, these people are risking life and limb to get the gospel message spread. And God put me in this little office, and I get to interact with these people and see them grow in the things of God. And I grew in the things of God. I went to school there too.
It's like sitting at the Grand Central Station of ministry, just getting to talk to people.
It was. And so I grew there and everything. And then the problems of my career in the military started creeping up. But after Gary and I got married, Dr. Seymour came out of his office and he goes, God wanted me to tell you he's going to restore you to your children.
Wow.
And I'm like, don't you dare say that to me, because you want to hit a nerve with me, and that was it. And I just looked at him, and I'm hoping, and I know he'll probably be hearing this, but I hope he and his wife come up here to visit. Because Dr. Seymour, when he speaks a word, you know it's coming directly from the throne room of God, because he gets about 2 inches from your nose, and you see the power of God coming at you, literally. And he kept saying that, and no, God's going to restore you. So when we got married and we moved into our house and stuff, I did what I always do. I send mass letters out. Of course, my oldest son, I didn't know where he was, because I gave him up for adoption. So I sent mass letters out telling people where I'm at and everything. And I went home from work one day, opened the mailbox, and there's a letter sitting there, and it's from my daughter. And she sat there and she goes, I first want to say, I love you, and I have no ill feelings for you. And I just sat back, and I'm like, oh my God, I'm screaming in my front yard. 14 years. And I got this letter.
Wow.
Then we started communicating on the phone, and my ex-husband sent me a email. Emails were just coming out, so he sent me an email, and that was in July, and in September she was sitting in my living room.
Wow.
She just turned 17. She wanted to move there then, and I sat there and I said, no, you have one more year of school, you need to finish where you're at, and everything. So we took her back so she could finish school. She was there on fall break, and we took her back, and we communicated with her. And in May, we went for her graduation, and my stepdaughter was with us and stuff. And that was the hardest thing I ever had to do. And
really?
that was sit in the bleachers at that stadium with my ex-mother and father-in-law, my ex-husband and his new wife, to see my daughter graduate from school, and then afterwards go back to my ex-in-law's house and break bread to celebrate. And everything. Gary will tell you, I am the most forgiving person he's ever met.
Because they're the ones that actually, took Jamie away from her back when she was young.
It wasn't my ex-husband. It was them.
But the fact that you said that's the hardest thing, I mean, you just told a story that was...
But
I know.
I mean,
it was like...
I can't imagine how hard that could have been.
And then on top of that, all of a sudden, it was a few years later, and I get an email. MySpace was coming out, and we had a MySpace account because we were youth pastors, and so we had a MySpace account to try and communicate with the kids. And all of a sudden, I get a friend's request from my youngest son. And it was like, oh my gosh. There's still work that needs to be done there.
Yeah.
So, but I'm like, oh my gosh, and he's awesome. He's a musician. I think it's his third album he just cut. He's over in Muscle Shoals and everything. Awesome musician and singer. And so I'm like, oh my God. When this started happening, Dr. Seymour's sitting there going, I told you.
Wow.
And I said, yeah, but there's an impossible one.
Yeah.
And I'm like, there's an impossible one. And even though on the paperwork for my son, when I gave him up for adoption, I said he can find me. You give him every bit of information about me. And I'm like, that one is not going to happen. And I was part of a online birth mother support group during that time. And because I was really trying to work toward my healing.
Yeah.
And the VA finally came through. 26 years of fighting with the VA, and I got my compensation for everything. And so what happened was I get this email from one of the ladies in the support group, and she said, have you contacted Catholic Charities again? And I said, look, I've spent too much money because that's all they want.
Yeah.
Yeah, fill this out. Send me this much money. Oh, we're going to have to do this. Send me this much money. Oh, we're going to have to do that. And I said, I am not spending another dime at Catholic Charities because the last person told me my file was destroyed. And they said, there's a new person there. This is her name. Her name was Paula. And Paula was sweet as can be. And she said, call her. This is her name, phone number, and email. Call her. She can help you. I'm like, okay, God, I'll do this one more time.
Yeah.
But I'm not sending him a dime. Not doing it. And everything. So I sat there at my desk at work, and it was the end of the day, and God said, write her an email and tell her your story. So I did. I wrote it out. Didn't even proof it. Just typed it out, sent it, hit send. Next day, I have an email from her. I have your file on my desk.
Oh my goodness.
I just need you to sign a release form. And I'm like,
wow.
Okay. So I signed the release form and sent it back. And she said, I sent a letter to the adoptive parents and everything, and I'm just waiting to hear back from them. Okay.
What?
And I'm like, this is going to be interesting.
Yeah.
So we took the kids to camp, and we were in Montgomery, Alabama. We brought them up here. There's Philip Cameron had a property that our church was helping him build for youth camps and stuff. So we had a work party up here. So we brought the kids up. There's no cell phone service.
Yeah.
None. There's one little spot on the property that if you hold your arm just right, you could get a signal. And so I kept checking my phone because I was waiting for a call back from this girl and everything. So we get back from camp, and she calls me at my office, and she's like, I spoke to your son today. And I'm like, what? And she goes, I spoke to him. He just needs to sign his release form. But he had sent an inquiry to find you.
What? What was Catholic Charities doing this whole time? Oh my goodness.
So I sat there and I said, okay. So we were just waiting for him to sign the release form.
Yeah.
And everything. So he signed it and got it back to them. And she called me and she said, are you sitting down? I said, yeah. And she goes, okay. He's going to call you. This is his name. This is his phone number.
Wow.
And everything. He wants you to know straight up front, he is hard of hearing. He's deaf in one ear, and he has Meniere's syndrome in the other. And so it's hard to talk on the phone sometimes. So if he asks you to repeat, it's only because of that. Okay. He's going to call you at 4:30. I'm like, okay.
Wow.
And she goes, I gave him your number. The home number, not my cell number. And I said, okay. I'm just sitting there shaking.
Wow.
And I went home that day, and I was pacing, waiting for the phone to ring. And so on July 31st, 2007, I heard my son's voice.
Goodness gracious.
And the first thing he said to me before he would let me talk, I need to tell you something so you know it's me. And I said, what's that? And he goes, the woman who gave you the phone number was the woman who adopted him. His adopted father was the eye surgeon there on base, and his wife volunteered in the nursery at times for babies that... Yeah.
What?
Yeah.
Oh my goodness.
And nobody knew about that phone number incident except me. Nobody knew it. I never told anybody. So I knew it was him because I didn't even know that's why she gave me the phone number. I didn't know. It was one of those fleeting things that happened in your life and you didn't know.
Yeah.
And when he said, I need to tell you who gave you the phone number, and I'm like, oh my God,
So the woman that gave you Paula's phone number?
No, the phone number for Catholic Charities to adopt him out.
Oh, okay.
Back when after he was born.
Oh my goodness.
The woman who adopted him.
So she tells me when Chris, his name is Chris, was taken from her, she walked by the nursery and that lady was rocking him.
Oh, wow.
Maggie could not. He was taken so fast from her that she didn't even get to hug him or nothing. He was gone.
Goodness.
And then she was the one that was rocking him, and she was the one that adopted him.
Yeah.
And now let her complete her story. Because that's how it all worked out.
So, for my birthday's the end of August, and for my birthday, he flew down to Tampa. And we went to a Rays game. I'm sorry, we're Rays fans. Go Rays.
Yeah. They're doing really good.
Yeah, go Rays. Anyway, so we went to a Rays game. My pastor's wife, she's a big Rays fan down there, and so she was there for the game when we walked in. So we all got to eat, and she got to meet him, and she runs over to him and just giving him a big old hug, and everything. So it was really good, and at that time he was living in Atlanta, and his adopted parents live here in Chattanooga.
Really?
Mm-hmm.
Wow.
Yeah. So it was basically developing into a family.
Yeah.
And everything. And he's walking out his testimony right now. I'll just leave it at that. But I was at his wedding. I was at the hospital when his baby was born.
Oh, wow.
And it was like, and occasionally it's like Dr. Seymour, it's like, see, I told you.
Yeah.
I told you. And so, yeah.
Goodness gracious.
So I was doing some praying about tonight.
Yeah.
And it was like, I was telling Gary, I said, I was trying to think of a word that describes my life. And I think man would say I'm a survivor.
Mm.
And I asked God what he says. And he says that I'm victorious.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the banner that he's got flying. And although I still have issues, I still have gaping wounds. I don't minister out of my gaping wounds because that's a work in progress and everything. But, I'm a firm believer no matter the circumstances, you have that baby. Abortion should never even be in the picture. And that's why when we did the choices thing here, it meant so much to me. And God has a sense of humor because, now I have one of my best friends here. She's an adopted mom, and here at the ministry, so it's like she's an adopted mom and I'm a birth mom, and it's like, so we're friends. So it's like, it's really amazing because for the first time in my entire life, I feel like I'm not judged for my past. And there was a scripture verse, and I wanted to read it and stuff, that I always camp on and everything as a reminder. And it's out of Philippians 3, verse 12 through 16. And it says, in the New King James Version is what I'm reading. It's the Bible Jesus carried. Anyway, so it says, "Not that I have already attained or I am already perfected, but I press on, that I may lay hold of that which Christ Jesus has also laid hold of me. Brethren, I do not count myself to have apprehended, but one thing I do, forgetting those things which are behind, and reaching forward to those things which are ahead. I press toward the goal for the prize of the upward call of God in Christ Jesus. Therefore, let us, as many as are mature, have this mind, and if in anything you think otherwise, God will reveal even this to you. Nevertheless, to the degree that we have already attained, let us walk by the same rule, and let us be of the same mind." And that scripture verse has always stayed out to me. I had given a Bible to my daughter when she was little, when she first went to live with her grandparents. And I wrote that scripture verse in the front of that Bible. And when she came back to my home 14 years later, she had that Bible in her hand. So, God can take the impossible and make it possible. I know this. There's many other little stories, and for the sake of time, so Gary, get through this.
Well, I mean, goodness gracious, that most of the time I enjoy it, but I interact a lot more. But that was like, there was so much power in your testimony.
Thank you.
The one thing that rang out that you summed up beautifully with that scripture there at the end is I just kept thinking to myself, what kept you going?
That.
Yeah. That I press on. That scripture sums it up so good, because it seemed like, and you said it a couple times, like God was so far away. It seemed like, in a culture of pride and just injustice and just being a victim of a horrible culture, you were just lost at sea, for lack of a better terms. And here and there, he threw beacons out like, hey, come back, hey, come back, hey, come back. But that scripture just sums it up so beautifully. And just, I press on. Forget the past, look forward, and press on.
That's it.
Oh my goodness.
I mean, there was ugly points. I mean, I did try suicide 3 times. And the last time, I actually went to the emergency room and said, I took this and I drank this with it, and I'm still here.
Wow.
And they looked at me, they did blood work and stuff, and they saw it in my system, and the doctor goes, you shouldn't be here. You should
Wow.
be. And I knew God had a plan.
Yeah.
It was just trying to get
through all of that.
Through it. Yes. And, during that time frame, there was nothing for women who went through what I went through. Nothing. There was no counseling. You were told you gave him up for adoption. It's a secret. You keep it a secret that you were raped. Don't use that word. I remember the first time I shared my testimony to a bunch of teenagers, and I used the word rape, and I got a phone call from a parent.
Wow.
Why did you have to use that word?
Wow.
And it's like, because that's what happened.
Yeah. And
it's like,
I mean, I'll go ahead and put this out there as there in the culture that we're in now, there's a lot of pushback for like women's lib, any kind of like, we've been wronged, injustice, we want to set this right. There's this odd like pushback. And I'm like, that only happens whenever people have no idea what's being fought for.
Right.
Because, I mean, you could listen just to this story and have enough not only information but inspiration to start fighting for anybody who's been victimized in any scenario. And at one point you pointed out the obvious, which I point out to people all the time, that church people can be pretty judgmental. There's plenty of words, but they can just not be Christian-like. I'll say that.
yes.
And to me, those are the most important people that need to get it through their heads that, hey, the world isn't perfect. Just because Jesus is perfect doesn't mean the world's perfect. So if Jesus were here, what would he do? Would he say, oh, please don't use the word rape? Or would he go and just fight for people who have been wronged?
Exactly.
Like,
exactly. I sat at a church, a women's group, and everything, and I shared my testimony, and right in the middle of me speaking in this women's group, this woman stood up and said, "You're a liar. The military would never let something like that happen." And there was an older woman that was there, and she knew what I was saying was true. It had been in the news and everything about women have been coming forward and stuff. There was a documentary that came out called The Invisible War. And if anybody could see that movie, it's very graphic, and because these survivors are telling their story. And, so it was being publicized around that same time. And this woman stood up and said that to me, and I paused for a minute, and I'm like, no, God didn't bring me this far to have somebody stand up and say this. And other ladies shut her down and stuff. But,
and it's very interesting because human beings really do the best they can, or the brain does, at trying to simplify things into understandable, digestible chunks. So a lot of times, like even just what I'm talking about, whenever I talk about Christians, it doesn't have anything to do with the place, the structure, the military. It's there, no matter where you look, whatever the structure is, doesn't matter. There's good and bad people. That's what it comes down to. Now, do those people use the structures to their advantage, to be prideful, to commit completely horrible injustices? Yes. But it's the people, and sometimes it sounds like in that scenario, especially in that day and age, the structures can be overwhelmed with that amount of people, so the whole structure can tend that way or be completely shaded that way. But it just comes down to the people. And so I remind myself, but also other people that way, is like, some people just have a bad taste about church, and to be honest, it's just like, well, it doesn't matter if it's church or anywhere, wherever you go, it's just people. And like, what's crazy to me is that I've never encountered a person who, when you get to know them and you get to know their story and you start seeing, oh, somebody did something horrible to you and this is a defense mechanism, and then it changes the whole game. Like, love surpasses everything.
That's it.
Man.
I mean, it's like God had a sense of humor when he brought me to work at that college, because the college office sat across this 4-lane highway in an old house that was converted into an office. And I have a hard time being alone in a room with another man. I have to really get to know that person. And I've asked God to give me good discernment to know when not to be. And so God put me in this office with Dr. Seymour, and it was just me and him alone in that building all the time. And I felt safe. Another person was brought into that office. I didn't feel safe. And I thank God, because my pastor and Dr. Seymour were both veterans, and
Yeah.
they could pick up on what was going on. And they're the ones that pushed me to get to the VA and get this settled.
Yeah.
And so it was like that person got moved out,
Yeah.
quickly
Yeah.
and stuff. Because I would come home and I would be freaking out, and
Yeah.
he'd be like, "What's the matter? What's the matter?" And I'm like, he walked in and he stood behind me
Yeah.
in my
It's
desk.
called a trigger, right?
Yeah.
Just
Oh, yeah.
different triggers, and it was just
She
different
didn't tell you this,
sayings.
but she was also a bad alcoholic at that time too, when she was going through all that. So she has, So I was kind of like, drinking a little bit, when we met, and then she said, "Well, you want to be with me,
Yeah.
you cannot drink."
Yeah.
So some people look at it like, "Oh, you guys are so holy, don't drink." But the reason is because she's a terrible alcoholic. So I don't,
Well, that's a matter of
just don't-
respect.
Yeah.
Yeah, because
she don't
a lot
drink, I
of
don't
people
drink.
whine. I'm going to use the word whine in church about like, well, can't we drink Jesus?
Yeah.
Wine, blah blah blah. And I'm like, well, it doesn't have anything.
not
With the
the
kids, I talk
same.
about swearing. It's like, no, it's I personally, it's your intent.
That's right.
Is it a respect or is it disrespect?
Exactly.
Right? Like, I could accidentally say a word that in a different culture means a horrible thing. I have no idea. But what is your intent?
Yes.
Like,
Well, I went to Trinidad on a missions trip, and I talked about earlier in my testimony that this one teacher was grooming and stuff. And one of the things he did, he gave me an anklet, piece of jewelry
Yeah.
around my ankle. And I had given it back to him, of course. But here we are years later, and I'm in Trinidad. And one of the girls that was with us, she had an anklet on, and the pastor down there, he told her, he said, "You don't wear anklets here." And she was like, "Why?" The meaning behind an anklet is that you are a slave to somebody. You are a sex slave to somebody.
wow.
Or a prostitute. You belong to somebody. And it was like, oh my God. And when he said it, it triggered
Yeah.
Wow.
back.
Yeah.
And I don't, it's like, if I see a girl wearing one, it's like, do you really know what that means?
Yeah.
And I'm thinking, how do I approach this? Because it's
Yeah.
like, this is what it means. And society, just everything goes now.
Yeah.
And there is a meaning behind everything. And stuff. So it's even like the housing pants when we were youth pastors.
Yeah.
It's like that was the craze, was the housing pants with the boys. And it's like, you do know that came from prison, and you know what it means.
Yeah.
And it's like,
Yep. Well, Miss Maggie, thank you for sharing that story. Man, we started this thing out with prayer, and all I want from any of these is just for it to be used for the kingdom. And you went through an unbelievable amount, but if it's any consolation whatsoever, I genuinely believe God will use every bit of that. So thank you for sharing it with
Thank
us.
you.
So we will end this one, and then we'll get into Brother Gary's testimony. So any parting thoughts before we wrap up this one, Miss Maggie?
keep your eyes focused on him.
Yes. Amen. Amen.
That's it.
Well, thank you again. And for all those listening, we hope you join us for the next podcast. And until then, we love you and we thank you for joining us. Farewell.